Hello and welcome to Formula One in 2023. Exactly 30 days until lights out in Bahrain, and launch season has already begun. It doesn't get much bigger than the reigning world champions Red Bull in New York City. To analyse that launch and to get into the big stories as we begin 2023, it is a warm welcome to Ted Kravitz, to Karun, Chandhok, and of course to Martin Brundle. I take it you've all wintered well, lads. In case any of you weren't watching on TV earlier, the Red Bull launch. Ted, I know you were, but what might they have missed?
Hello, Simon. Yes, I was. I couldn't stay away from that kind of thing. It was rather good, actually. I know some people online were taking the mickey about it. I thought it was good. With some enthusiastic hosts. There was Marty and Giselle. Christian Horner was front and center at the beginning, explaining why it was in New York City, because we now have 3 races in the US, with Las Vegas joining Miami and Austin. So Christian said we thought it was only fitting that they were launching Red Bull in the USA. He's talking about how the team are still Mavericks. The host mentioned Honda, but Christian Horner didn't, which might have had something to do with the announcement that was to come later in the launch that we'll get onto. But Christian was talking about the season to come and how Red Bull are going to have to be, quote, on top of their game, because they're expecting a harder challenge from Ferrari and Mercedes, or their rivals. He didn't actually mention Ferrari and Mercedes by name. They introduced some Red Bull extreme athletes, one of whom, interestingly and amusingly, was Miles Chamley-Watson, who is a US Olympic team fencer who happens to be best mates with Lewis Hamilton. But he's also a Red Bull athlete. But he didn't mention the fact that he tends to go to races, or previously went to races as a guest of Lewis Hamilton, but now I'm sure will go to races as a guest of Red Bull. There was somebody called Mr. Doodle who turned up halfway through, doing some doodles on what looked like an AlphaTauri car. But we didn't hear from Mr. Doodle, unfortunately. But we did hear from Daniel Ricciardo, and that was good to see him. He was full of smiles. He was talking about returning home to the team where he knows so many people, where he feels warm and cozy, he said. Ricciardo coming back and how he's going to contribute to the season of Verstappen and Perez by talking to the engineers and doing a lot of simulator work. We had a new clothing sponsor, Castore, coming in for Red Bull. Then we heard from Checo and Max. They turned up. They did very well. Christian Horner was asked by Marty an interesting question. Your job is to maintain something that seems like harmony in the team. How difficult is that? But Christian Horner just gave him a straight bat answer. And then Horner said something interesting, I thought. He said, this is the best driver pairing that we've ever had at Red Bull in Formula One. So Martin, Karun, you can pick up on that. Max Verstappen talking about the season to come. He's saying how he's always looking for personal growth and improvement. Max said, nobody's perfect, and I'm going to see where I can learn and improve. Checo Perez, largely the same thing. And then finally, Simon, we had the reveal of what they said was the new car, but it looked very much like last year's car. So I think it probably was last year.
That's an excellent pricing. You love launches. There's no doubt about it, Ted. I always strolling through Central Park down towards Times Square, and as luck would have it, I happened upon the Red Bull launch. But yeah, let's just pick up on what Ted was saying there with regards to Christian's sake, the best pairing, Martin, that they've ever had in Formula One, getting an early plaster over the old wounds, which maybe they've healed over the winter between those two teammates.
Great Red Bull launch notebook there, Ted. Thank you. Indeed, I mean, what does Christian mean when he says best? Does he mean that they fit together well as a combo? In other words, that Sergio is probably a little bit more compliant than perhaps Mark Webber or Sebastian Vettel would have been. So odd in that respect, but Christian's got the data, and that's what he thinks, and he's the boss. But as you say, if they're the two you've got going into the season ahead, why not say nice things about them? But I find the whole thing fascinating, actually, in terms of obviously Formula One in the USA is becoming quite massive, and the fans, I believe, are going to be able to design the livery of the Red Bull with the 3 US races coming up this season, which is an interesting concept. We'll see what they look like. But obviously, as always, the car looked pretty benign. It's very smooth. Adrian Newey is famous for signing things off a few days after the last possible date to have them made in time, because he wants to keep developing up until he really can't anymore. So I think, obviously it's a car that headed off over to America some time ago and doesn't really represent the 2023 car. I found it odd, you alluded to it, that there were Honda badges on the team gear they were wearing. Quite a mishmash of team gear, really. But of course, it was really the Ford announcement, and that's super exciting for Formula One. We thought it was going to be Red Bull Porsche, and it turns out it's Red Bull Ford in the end.
Yeah, on that very subject, I mean, let's get into it. It's obvious the reasons why they've done the launch in America as a result of that, with a bit of foresight, I suppose. But I think it was only 8 months ago, wasn't it? They were kind of dotting the I's and crossing the T's. It seemed on a collaboration with Porsche, and that, of course, fell away because Christian and the rest of the senior management wanted to maintain that independence. What is it you think that Ford can offer Red Bull then that Porsche couldn't, Karun?
I think Ford have got the best deal here because, they don't need to invest the resources that Audi are doing, for example, by coming in as a whole team. It's going to cost them hundreds of millions to get it all up and running for a period of time. They're going to walk into an existing race-winning, championship-winning operation who've got an engine department that's well and truly on their path to the 2026 rules. They've heavily recruited, poached a whole bunch of people from Mercedes, we know, in the last 18 months. And for Ford, it's essentially a badging exercise. So it's going to cost them a lot less to be involved with a team at the forefront of the sport. And, they've got previous form in this, Simon, actually. When you go back to the 60s, when they arrived with the famous Ford Cosworth DFV, which then carried on racing, I think, Martin, into your era in the 80s, they still had Ford badges on it. And that was very much the same exercise. Ford spent $100,000 back then, which is the best investment they could have made into the sport, and got a whole heap of exposure over 3 decades. And I think for them, it's a great deal. Clearly, as you said there, both Christian and Helmut didn't want to give up control, and that was the limiting factor, we believe, on the Porsche deal, and that's not a problem here with the Ford deal. So I think it's a win-win for both Red Bull and Ford.
Okay, but what we're seeing at the moment, obviously, from the FIA is that the tender going out, if you want to apply to become a Formula One team, you got to pay 20 grand. That's non-refundable. Then 300 grand for the admin costs alone. And then, eventually it's going to be a $200 million dilution fee that whichever team, comes into has to have paid. And I just wonder, are we going to start seeing the manufacturers come in? Is it now there appears to be 2 models, doesn't there, Martin? And that is the Audi Sauber model and the model we're just talking about with Ford and Red Bull, and the Andretti with GM and Cadillac. Can you understand why this is causing quite a bit of friction, the 2 different models here, and the 11th team in particular, most of the teams are against?
Yeah, getting more teams in is a logistical thing as well as a financial aspect. Will they fit in the pit lane, the paddock, on the grid? How many cars do we need? I think 24 cars would be great, personally. We've got 30 races this season, 23 Grand Prix, 29 in the end now. And China's been cancelled, and 6 sprint races with 20 cars on the grid. I don't think it's quite enough of a show, personally, and opportunity. But, if you look at the Ford thing, it's halfway house, really. And I agree with Karun, it's an interesting way of doing it. Red Bull had Infinity on for a while, then it had Aston Martin on the side of it for a while, before Aston got their own team. So this is a branding thing. What I find most interesting here is all of the world's car manufacturers are totally focused on electric cars, EVs coming up. And yet they won't, if you look at the Ford announcement today, they love the idea of the technology, sustainability, sustainable fuels and opportunity. And then basically eyeballs, the number of people who are watching Formula One now, who are not watching other Formula with just battery power, for example. So it's interesting that they even want to be involved in Formula One, but it's just the might that it has at the moment. So they're coming in different ways. So this is sort of a sponsorship plus with Ford. They say they're going to get involved in the technology, and it's a way of Red Bull then being able to badge that engine. Of course, Honda have also are one of the six that have put their name down for the 2026 motor, but they won't have a team. So where could they go? Could it be General Motors? Could it be an Andretti style thing? Alpine don't have a customer team. Renault, as it used to be called, of course. So what we do know is it looks like we've got six original equipment manufacturers, OEMs as they're called, signed up for the new 2026 motor. You know, I did an interview about the new Braun documentary coming out, and back in 2008, 2009, Honda pulled out. We lost Super Aguri at the same time. The following year, BMW pulled out. Then Toyota withdrew completely. And we were terrified where that was all heading. And maybe we were going to have to get Cosworth Motors in and Judd Motors in. And suddenly here we are with six manufacturers signed up for the long term here. So overall, really good news for F1.
Okay, well, what's your take on it then, Ted? Because, is this the start then? Are we going to get a manufacturing boom, as Martin just alluded to then? And what do you think of the major reasons behind all of these guys coming in and saying, okay, all right, it's a good time to get in?
Well, let's hear it from Jim Farley, who's the president and CEO of the Ford Motor Company. He said that at Ford, they had looked at various racing series that they wanted to get involved in. They looked at Formula One over time. Obviously, when they left Formula One, they ended up selling their own team to Red Bull for $1, and then on the basis that Red Bull would invest a lot of money into it, 400 million over a few years. And now we have Red Bull taking some more money off Ford to badge their engine department. But that was the crucial thing about it. And going back to what you're saying about why didn't Porsche work with Red Bull and where Ford does, is that Ford is effectively supporting Red Bull powertrains. So Ford doesn't want to come into Red Bull technology, who build and design the cars. They don't want to come into Red Bull Racing, who run the cars on the racetrack, the way that Porsche potentially did. So it's just getting involved in Red Bull powertrains, which will be now Red Bull Ford. It will be Ford is effectively running the engine department. And Jim Farley said that, we saw that the direction that Formula One is going into is a sweet spot for us because it's balancing the internal combustion engine with an awful lot of EV technology. And for them, it's the EV technology, the battery technology, the control electronics, the analytics, the way to system management of EVs that Ford has found so interesting and transferring into their road cars. And because, as Jim Farley said, Formula One is making EVs and battery technology and hybrid exciting. And that's what they want to translate to their Ford customers. They want to show them that EVs, not just any old cars, they can be trucks, they can be bikes, they can be anything. They are exciting. And that's what Ford sees in this link up with Red Bull.
Can I just get into the FIA President Mohammed bin Sulayem? I suppose, putting it mildly, not covered himself in glory recently. I think the thing that irked the teams and Formula One the most was his comments on the valuation of the sport. What have you made of it all?
Well, I think certainly the relationship is on the edge at the moment between the FIA and Formula One. I think publicly last year they were playing nice, although we all know from within the paddock and behind the scenes it was all getting a bit fractious. But from the letters that have been fired across, it's clear now it's open war. I think the president of the FIA put some very strong tweets out, which the owners of Formula One, the Liberty Group, and Formula One bosses at Stefano Domenicali, and so they didn't take that well, and it seems a degree of confusion, right, as to Mohammed bin Sulayem implying that the FIA somehow should have control over the value of F1 and who it's sold to, but actually the 100-year agreement that was signed famously between Bernie Ecclestone and Max Mosley awarded effectively a lease to Formula One management, and that runs till 2110, so a little while away from now. I think at the time there was effectively the Don King clause, which gave the FIA certain veto rights over who Formula One was sold to, but that's no longer valid because Formula One has since been listed on the New York stock market. So frankly, any of us can go buy shares, right? So I think that there's a little bit of confusion there as to bin Sulayem implying that they have control over who F1 is sold to, whereas F1 quite clearly saying, no, you don't. We have got these agreements in place for a reason. So, yeah, and I think, the thing about Bin Sulayem publicly supporting the Andretti bid, I think that's all wrapped up in this political battle, right? It's just another bit of this battle here, which is it's going to rumble on. Do the fans at home really care? Probably not. What they all want to know is, are Andretti going to be on the grid or not? It's a simple question. But yeah,
would you like to see him on the grid, Karun? Would you like to see them on the grid?
Personally, I would, and I agree with Martin. I think we have too few cars on the grid. I don't like the fact that the Formula 2 champions in the last few years, Nick de Vries and Oscar Piastri have eventually got to F1, but they could well have fallen by the wayside. Felipe Drugovich hasn't got there. I think we haven't got enough places for young drivers coming through, and I'd like to see 20, 22, 24 cars on the grid.
How serious is this war? If we're calling it a war, Martin, do you think at the moment between the FIA and is it a cold war between the FIA and the teams at the moment?
I think it's a big story. You look back, when it was Bernie Ecclestone and Max Mosley, it was quite a comfortable setup. Mosley at the FIA. Bernie, of course, was the commercial rights holder on behalf of the teams, and it worked extremely well in many respects for that period of time when we were building F1. But and it was very powerful because if Bernie didn't frighten the teams on the commercial side, Max did on the regulatory side. But for me, the FIA is about regulating motorsport and Formula One in particular, and policing. So then you had Chandhok next, and he was very passive. He very much let Liberty get on with it and didn't get involved in the commercial aspect of it. Now Mohammed bin Sulayem has come in and is very much sort of stating the case that, hey, I'm in charge around here. The FIA calls the shots. We'll decide who's coming on the grid and who's not. And that seems to me to be quite a crossover into the commercial realms, which I understand the paperwork and the EU paperwork that was in place in 2001 prohibited that from happening. So we've got a standoff. And definitely Mohammed bin Sulayem's come in and wants to very much change the ground rules, and we'll see how that works out. The teams now, because 200 million to get on the grid seemed like they thought a fair number, but of course because of the incredible work I must say Liberty have done and increasing the value of Formula One and the franchises of those 10 Formula One teams, now they want a shed load more money because they think their teams are worth up to $1 billion. So it's quite interesting times, and I can see more and more of this briefing off record and the head to head, while Stefano at Formula One and Ben Sulayem at FIA decide who's calling the shots.
Yeah, I mean, it's always fascinating with these kind of standoffs. Start the season. I'm not sure. I can remember when we had one like this in recent times. It seems like it's incendiary already.
But Simon, I think the Ben Sulayem tweet when he was talking about the value of Formula One, that was what really annoyed Formula One. He was talking about the inflated value of Formula One. I think that's what really the teams felt that he was overstepping his mark. But I thought the interesting tweet recently about the FIA inviting applicants to join the grid when it's not really the FIA's decision on whether they can come in. You like cricket, Simon. Can I liken it to Lord's Cricket Ground in the MCC? It felt like Ben Sulayem saying, please come and join Formula One was a bit like Camden Council, who operate the rules around Lord's Cricket Ground, inviting people to become members of the MCC, which is, of course, an organisation that has a 27-year waiting list, and you're lucky if you can get in. Does that analogy stand up to you?
It might stand up. Yeah, it might stand up, albeit on a slightly more, shall we say, inner city London level rather than on an international level like this one. If you could call
but it wasn't the
emphasis
FIA's.
on
It's not the
John's
FIA's gift to invite people to join Formula One. That's Dominicali and all the teams. And the teams at the moment are saying, no, thank you, Andretti. We'll have to see how that goes. But it's different here. It's very difficult because it's different here. What Andretti and General Motors are saying are that they're going to badge an engine that's not theirs, and they want to come in as a new team. What Ford and Red Bull are saying is that they're the championship team. They've got a great partner who wants to invest in the electrification or hybridization or whatever of their power units. And so that's of value to everybody. So that's where the difference is between the Andretti General Motors stuff and what we've seen from Red Bull and Ford today, I think.
But if you've got Andretti Autosport and you've got GM and Cadillac, all three, huge names in the US, sometimes do you feel that the teams are quite introspective? They're happy with their lot. They're very profitable at the moment. It's never been in a better place. However, you bring them in, again, the pot can get bigger. The slices of a bigger pot into the pie. I don't know what you think, Martin, but is it all about, let's continue being as expansive as possible for the good of the sport, and actually the numbers will follow?
In a way, it seems a no-brainer, doesn't it, to have the great name of Andretti on the grid and Cadillac and see how they operate a team in the way that Haas does now, if they're partly US-based and partly European-based, for example. But the other teams don't want to give up their hard-earned success to this point. They've invested. There were times when they were losing tens and hundreds of millions, and they're going to, hey, just because it's going well, we're not just going to let people in the club for nothing. We're not going to dilute our own share. If they get 20 million each, that will be gone in a heartbeat if they have to dilute it 11 ways instead of 10. So I can understand the team saying, we've got it to this point. You're not just going to jump on the bandwagon cheaply. And so I don't think it's anti-Andretti or anti-anybody, really. I think it's just, let's just sort the ground rules out here. And of course, the Concord Agreement runs out at the end of 2025 anyway. So then we've got all that starting again. So it's interesting times. And as ever, it's all about money, isn't it? It's all about vast amounts of money. And you just want to bang heads together sometimes and go, let's just think about the big picture here and think about Formula One. But that'll be secondary.
A couple of quick ones, just very quickly before we go. Appointment, Karun, of James Vowles as a team principal at Williams, and I'll do the same to you, Ted, if I could, with Andrea Stella moving up into a really premium position now at McLaren. If you could start, Karun, with James.
I think it caught most of the paddock by surprise. I do wonder whether there's some Mercedes element to this deal, because it's very rare that you find someone, certainly in a senior position of a team, move across with 0 gardening leave, and James has done that. So clearly a very amicable thing. I mean, to the point at which I think Mercedes basically were orchestrating the press announcement in some ways, or certainly liaising with the media. So I think it's a good move, actually. I like the fact that they've gone for a bold move in terms of getting someone who hasn't done the role before, but someone with an engineering background who's recently worked with a top team. He's going to bring technical knowledge. He's going to bring an understanding of a team structure that perhaps, Williams didn't have in recent times. And he's a smart guy. We all know James from the paddock. He's got a strong work ethic and, he's a smart guy. But Formula One teams are like big tankers, Simon. You can't just pivot quickly. It's going to take a long time and a lot of work, I think. He's got his work cut out for him. I think the biggest challenge is how quickly can he poach other top people from other teams, I think, because you can have all the technology in the world, but it is still a human sport. And, you need that brain power. So how quickly can he poach that brain power? That will be key to his success.
And Ted?
Well, yeah, we're seeing sort of 2 tiers of Formula One team principals now. We're seeing the sort of engineer team principal, the likes of, I guess you could say, Andreas Seidel, but he's moved up a bit, James Vowles, Andrea Stella. They're all sort of engineers who've moved into the role. And then we're seeing the old style team principal like Christian Horner, and Toto Wolff and Fred Vasseur, who's moved to Ferrari, who's started his review of the company. He said he's not going to change anything too soon. He wants to understand why Ferrari have made all the mistakes they did last year, and he's not going to start making too many changes too quickly, which I think is a good sign, establishing some concrete foundations under Fred Vasseur. We have Alessandro Aluni Bravi, who used to be Robert Kubica's manager, but he's been CEO at Sauber for a while, so he's going to be the team representative, not quite team principal, underneath Andreas Seidel at Sauber. And of course, as you mentioned, Andrea Stella at McLaren. So that's a big job for Andrea Stella, ex-Ferrari engineer, now running McLaren. And he's never been a team principal before. He's been in senior roles, and now he's got to actually go up to the top level, like James Vowles, an engineer making that step up. Should be interesting to see.
Okay, guys, thank you very much, Ted, Karun, Martin, for your company this evening. Obviously, Sky Sports F1 is the place for all of the launches. We'll be live with you throughout testing from Bahrain, February the 23rd from 7 in the morning. And we hope to see you all again very, very soon as we look towards the start of the 2023 Formula One season. Bye-bye.